Hello, I'm speaking today with author Antoine Vanner about his latest book, Britannia's Amazon. It's the fifth in the historic naval adventure series, The Dawlish Chronicles, and it features as a main character Florence Dawlish, who is the wife of Captain Nicholas Dawlish. Antoine, it covers some pretty dark and brutal issues, and it's told from a woman's perspective. And I'm just wondering, what inspired you to take this change of direction from the previous books?
Well, frankly, I don't really think it's a change of direction, because Florence has been an integral part of the story from the very beginning and has been a key figure in some of the earlier books. But in this case, her husband has set off for the Far East for the adventures which were covered in the previous book, Britannia Spartan, and she's left alone in Britain. She's facing a separation of probably about a year. She intends to spend that time in what are rather mundane and worthy, but perhaps also boring, good works. She's very much concerned with the welfare of sailors' families. And then through events totally outside her control, she finds herself confronted with the squalid realities that underlie respectable Victorian society. And she finds herself confronted with things she just in all conscience cannot walk away from. And in doing so, she exposes herself to, not just herself, to considerable danger, but in fact her behaviour may also be damaging her beloved husband's career. So it's quite a strong story, and I believe it's very much in the spirit of the series.
It always seems somewhat of a challenge to me for a man to write from the point of view of a woman.
Well, yes, it is always difficult, I think, for a man to write from a woman's point of view, and probably vice versa. But in this case, the problem is compounded by the fact that Florence is a Victorian woman, and Victorian woman of the 1880s, with all the values and all the outlooks and expectations of the time. She's also got to cope with the fact that she's from a pretty humble background that some people do not hesitate to remind her of. There's also significant limitations placed upon her freedom of action, her freedom of movement, as would be expected of any lady of the time. But for me, the challenge of writing about her was also in relation to the smaller details of being a woman as compared to being as a man. Yeah? And for that I was lucky that I got a lot of input from when I passed my first draft for comment by some writer friends, female writer friends. Yeah? And I got advice on things like that when Florence gets jostled on the street, for example, her first reaction is to clutch her handbag, check the handbag. I wouldn't have thought of that. When she is involved in a brawl in the street through no fault of her own, as soon as she gets home, the first thing she does is to strip off and bathe herself. So it's in these smaller details, I think, that frankly a man would never really think straight off that the challenge really comes. And with the help of some of my friends, I think I've got that right.
I believe you said at one point that you felt as if the book had written itself. Can you explain that process?
Well, by this stage, the fifth book in the series, I know Florence quite well. I know some of the other major characters in the story as well. I have a very good idea of how they'll react and how they'll behave, how they'll talk in certain circumstances. Once I've set the plot up, I can quite easily visualize how they act in it. But of course, characters do tend to take off in directions you didn't really expect to at the beginning. Yeah? So they do begin to live a life of their own. And that's a very important part of the story, really, that you cope with that. Florence herself is the major player, of course, in the whole story. But some other major characters like Agatha, her friend, who figures in earlier books, and also Agatha's rather unpleasant brother, Lord Oswald, who also figured in some of the stories. Not a particularly nice man, and Florence has had some problems with him before. But now in the course of the action of this story, she's got to revise her opinion of him somewhat, and she and he have got to work closely together. But the writing process isn't really a question only of sitting at the keyboard and tapping the keys. I'd regard that as about 50%. And the other 50, I do that in the mornings. And the other 50% of the work is done in the afternoons during long walks with my dog Rufus. And as I walk around, I think about what was written that morning. Very often I get ideas for improving it, which I'll work in the next day. But I also have a clear idea as to what the starting point is now for the following scenes and for the following action. And I'm in the process of creating a movie in my head, so I can, practically see it. And the challenge then comes the next day is actually getting down that movie, writing the script for it. So yes, it's a very rewarding process, but as I said, it's not just a question of hitting the keys. It's that internal creative process within my own head.
Can you tell us a little about the story and how it links to the pressing social issues of the day and the social conscience that was beginning to develop at the time?
Well, it's very much a story of the 1880s, which is really the decade which was the break point between the early Victorian period and the more modern world which the grandparents of my generation grew up in. It was still a period of great difference between wealth and poverty, and for the first time people were beginning to realize that not only should something be done about it, but something could be done. It was a period when investigative journalism was taking off and revealing appalling abuses, particularly sexual abuses, trading and trafficking in young women, in girls, boys, etc. Appalling working and living conditions in the slums, but the awareness that change was possible. It was also a time when homosexuality was still illegal in Britain and was very severely punished. And that would continue to be the case until 1968. So that many men were forced to lead secret lives, which were very unhappy lives, which also laid them wide open to blackmail on a massive scale. Another one of the themes of the book. The aristocracy were slowly beginning to lose their grip on political power. The middle classes were taking over. And the aristocracy are also under some financial pressure. One of the solutions to which was to bring in the so-called dollar princesses from the United States, the daughters of American millionaires. They brought the money with them, and the bridegrooms brought the titles of nobility. A typical example of this was Winston Churchill's mother. And these liaisons sometimes did not work out well at all. So we see something of this in the book as well. It was also a time of awareness that the working conditions had to be improved, particularly the plight of women working in factories. Well, an important part of the story is the fact that Florence and her friends are very mobile in this book. They need to be as part of the plot. She moves a lot around the south of England. And this was a period when rail travel was very rapid, very efficient, probably more efficient than it is today in some cases. It was a time when the telegraph system was up and running. There was a very efficient postal system with 3 deliveries a day within 24 hours of posting, so that people were able to use these methods of communication more or less in the way we use email today. And indeed in the book you'll see the first appearance also of a telephone. And these improved methods of communication were particularly important for the emancipation of women, because it allowed them to get out and move about, interact with their friends in a way which never happened before. And that is one of the underlying themes within this book.
The book includes a bonus in the form of a short story, Britannia's Eye, which explains a period of Nicholas Dawlish's life as a child. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Well, readers of the earlier books will remember that Dawlish has got a very small private income that accrues from land that he inherited from a favourite uncle. This uncle was himself a naval officer, but he had to retire early due to ill health. He had consumption, tuberculosis, and he retired to a spa town in the Pyrenees in a futile hope of recovering his health. He was very fond of Nicholas, who was a small boy at the time, and he resolved to make him his heir. Nicholas came to live with him for the last few months of this man's life, and the experience was to have a very important influence on him for the rest of his career. Unfortunately, Nicholas never knew the full story about this man, and he always regarded his uncle as being a failure, although he still loved him. But now, when in the story in Britannia's Eye, we got a completely different perception of who and what this man actually was. And of course the tragedy was that Nicholas himself never knew what we reveal in the story.
Assuming there are further books to come in the Dawlish Chronicles series, will we be seeing a return to the naval adventures of Captain Nicholas Dawlish?
Well, I already have, and the 6th book in the series is actually finished and is being revised at the moment. So we'll see that being published in a few months' time as well. Yeah? And in that we see Nicholas once again fighting for Queen and country on the fringes of empire. He's going to have some very, very exciting adventures and find himself in very unpleasant situations, one which he certainly will not enjoy, but one which I think will be entertaining to the reader. So let's look forward to that as well as just Britannia's Amazon.
Thank you, Antoine Vanner.
And thank you, Eva Lagasse.